October 1886, Arizona Territory. A 10-year-old girl, barefoot and covered in ash, drags a dying Apache warrior out of a burning trash furnace where men like McDurrow dispose of anything and anyone that stands in their way. Her name is Isabel Reyes. His name is Koa. Neither knows that weeks later, the same tiny hands that saved him will draw a flaming arrow across the night sky and set an entire outlaw camp ablaze, turning the hunter into the hunted and the forgotten into legends. This is the true story of how a child armed with nothing but courage and a burning arrow rewrote the fate of two peoples. Stay until the end. You'll never look at ashes the same way again. If this already gave you chills, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and drop in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to tell someone about what happens next. Let's ride. Silver Bend, Arizona Territory, October 1886. The desert wind howled like a coyote with a burr in its paw, kicking up dust that stung the eyes and choked the throat. The town was a scatter of sun-bleached shacks and false-front saloons, where the law was just a word men spat into the dirt before drawing iron. At the edge of it all, where the air smelled of scorched dreams and melted tin, stood the trash furnace, a hulking, blackened beast that devoured what little Silver Bend deemed worthless. And in its shadow, a 10-year-old girl scratched out a living from its ashes. Isabel Reyes was all bones and grit, her dark hair tied back with a strip of burlap, her bare feet calloused as rawhide. Her hands, small but steady, sifted through the furnace's leavings. Bent nails, bottle shards, scraps of copper, anything she could trade for a loaf of stale bread. Her mother, Maria, was wasting away in their tattered canvas tent, each cough a wet rasp that echoed like a death knell. The doc in town wanted $2 to even look at her, so Isabel dug deeper, her fingers blackened by soot, her eyes burning from the smoke. This morning, the furnace was still warm, its embers glowing like the eyes of something hungry. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the Red Rock Hills, and the air carried a chill that bit through Isabel's threadbare dress. She knelt in the ash, sorting her meager haul, when her hand brushed something that wasn't metal or glass. It was warm, soft, and it twitched. She froze, heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. A hand, burned, blistered, but alive. She scraped away the ash, revealing a man's arm, then a chest, then a face. Bronze skin streaked with blood and soot, long black hair matted with grime. His eyes were half open, glassy, but they locked onto hers with a desperation that made her breath catch. He was Apache. Young, maybe 20. His body a map of bruises and rope burns. Someone had beaten him to the edge of death and tossed him here to burn. Isabel knew what that meant. McDurrow, the marshal who ran Silver Bend like his personal fiefdom, didn't leave loose ends. He worked for the land speculators in Tucson, men who'd sell their own kin for a square mile of dirt. An Apache in the furnace wasn't an accident. It was a message. She should have run. Should have left him and pretended she saw nothing. But those eyes, haunted, like her mother's when the fever took hold, rooted her to the spot. She dropped her sack and clawed at the ash, dragging him free. He was heavy, limp as a sack of grain, his shallow breaths rattling like dry leaves. She found an old tarp in the refuse, wrapped him in it, and pulled with all her might. Her arms burned, her knees buckled, but she hauled him across the rocky ground to the tent, a quarter-mile of sweat and fear. Maria was awake, propped on a crate, her face pale as bone. When Isabel stumbled in, dragging the tarp, Maria's eyes widened. "Madre de Dios, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice a thread. "He's alive, Mama," Isabel panted, unwrapping the tarp. The man groaned, a low sound that cut through the morning quiet. His chest rose and fell. Barely. Maria crawled closer, her hands trembling as she touched his burned skin. "They'll kill us," she said. But her tone wasn't anger. It was surrender. She knew what it was to be thrown away. "Then we die anyway," Isabel said, meeting her mother's gaze. "But not today." They worked fast. Maria boiled water over a meager fire, tearing strips from an old petticoat for bandages. Isabel fetched a tin cup, dribbling water between the man's cracked lips. His name, they'd learn later, was Koa. For now, he was just a stranger who needed them. And in Silver Bend, needing someone was the closest thing to a bond. Outside, the furnace smoked, its stench curling into the tent like a warning. Isabel peeked through the flap, scanning for McDurrow's men. The marshal's shadow loomed over the town, his spurs jingling like coins in a gambler's pocket. If he sniffed out an Apache hiding in their tent, there'd be no trial, no mercy. Just a quick rope or a bullet. Isabel turned back to Koa, his face lit by the flicker of their single candle. She didn't know why she'd saved him, only that letting him burn felt like letting herself burn too. And in a town where hope was just another thing to toss in the fire, that was a risk worth taking. As Isabel watched Koa's candlelit face, her heart clung to a stubborn truth. Saving him was the only thing keeping her own spark alive in this ash-choked town. But outside, Silver Bend was waking, and McDurrow's shadow was already creeping closer. The dawn broke over Silver Bend like a cracked eggshell, spilling pale light across a town that never slept easy. The furnace's smoke hung low, a gray shroud over the tent where Isabel and Maria kept their secret. Koa lay on a pile of burlap sacks, his breaths shallow but steadier now, his burns wrapped in Maria's torn petticoat. Isabel sat cross-legged beside him, her small hands smudged with soot, eyes darting to the tent flap every time a coyote yipped or a board creaked in the distance. McDurrow's men were out there. She'd seen their boot prints in the dirt, fresh as a snake's trail, circling closer each morning. Maria knelt by the fire, stirring a pot of thin corn gruel, her coughs sharp as gunshots in the quiet. "He can't stay, Mija," she whispered, glancing at Koa. "If they find him, it's not just us. They'll burn every tent from here to the arroyo." Isabel's jaw tightened. "Then we hide him better. I ain't letting him die." Maria's eyes softened, but before she could answer, Koa stirred, his voice a rasp, like gravel under boots. "Nalin," he muttered, head lolling. "Nalin, don't—" His hand twitched, as if reaching for someone long gone. Isabel leaned closer, her braid brushing the dirt. "Who's Nalin?" she asked, but Koa's eyes were glassy, lost in fever. She didn't push. She'd seen that look before, in Maria's face when the laudanum ran dry, in her own reflection when hunger clawed her belly. Loss had a way of carving itself into you. By noon, the town buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. McDurrow's men rode through, their spurs clinking, eyes scanning every alley and lean-to. Isabel slipped out to the furnace, pretending to scavenge, her sack half empty to avoid suspicion. She spotted Jake Tully, McDurrow's right hand, leaning against a saloon post, his squint fixed on the furnace grounds. Her stomach twisted. Tully wasn't the kind to sniff around for nothing. She ducked behind a pile of charred wagon wheels, heart pounding. That's when she saw it. A single eagle feather, half buried in the ash near where she'd found Koa. Apache. Her fingers shook as she tucked it into her dress. If Tully found it, he'd know someone had survived the furnace. She hurried back, the feather burning a hole in her pocket. Inside the tent, Koa was awake, propped against a crate, his dark eyes clearer but heavy with pain. Maria was rebandaging his burns, her hand steady despite her trembling breath. Isabel dropped to her knees, showing them the feather. "They're looking," she said, voice low. "Tully's out there. I think they know someone got away." Koa's face hardened, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "They'll kill you for hiding me," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I go tonight." "No," Isabel snapped, louder than she meant. "You can't even stand, and if they catch you, they'll come for us anyway." She looked at Maria, pleading. "We need a plan, Mama. Somewhere to hide him proper." Maria hesitated, then nodded. "The old smuggler's ditch, out past the saguaros. It's dry, hidden. Used to be for whiskey runners." She glanced at Koa. "Can you walk by dusk?" Koa tested his weight, wincing as his burned arm grazed the crate. "I'll manage." But dusk brought trouble faster than they'd hoped. Hoofbeats thundered outside, and Tully's voice cut through the evening like a knife. "Reyes, open up, or we tear this rag heap down!" Isabel's blood went cold. She shoved Koa toward the back flap, where a pile of old barrels hid a shallow crawl space. He slid in, silent as a shadow, while Maria yanked the flap open. Tully loomed in the doorway, his hat tilted low, a lantern casting jagged shadows. 2 men flanked him, rifles slung low. "Heard you've been scavenging more than scrap, Maria," he drawled, stepping inside. His boots tracked ash across the dirt floor. "Got an Apache stinking up the place?" Maria stood tall, though her hands shook. "Just me and my girl, Tully. You know that." He smirked, kicking over a crate. Isabel held her breath, her back pressed to the tent wall, inches from where Koa hid. Tully's eyes swept the room, lingering on the burlap pile. Then he grabbed Isabel's arm, yanking her forward. "You seen anything funny out by the furnace, kid? Don't lie now." Her mouth went dry, but she met his gaze, thinking of the feather in her pocket. "Just ash and broken glass," she said, voice steady. "Same as always." Tully's grip tightened, then released. He spat into the dirt. "McDurrow don't like mysteries. We'll be back." He turned, his men following, but not before one knocked over the gruel pot, spilling their supper into the fire. The hoofbeats faded, but Isabel's heart didn't slow. She helped Koa out, his face slick with sweat. "They'll come again," he said. "I'm poison to you." "Then we move you tonight," Maria said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "But you're not dying on my watch." As the moon rose, pale as a bone, they slipped out. Koa leaning on Isabel's shoulder, Maria scouting ahead. The smuggler's ditch was a mile out, a narrow gash in the earth hidden by mesquite and shadow. They lowered Koa in, covering him with branches. Isabel pressed the eagle feather into his hand. "For Nolan," she whispered. "Whoever he was." Koa's fingers closed around it, his eyes unreadable. "You don't know what you're risking, little one." "I know enough," she said, and turned back to the tent, the night swallowing her small frame. But as she walked, a new fear gnawed at her. Tully's men weren't just hunting Koa. They were hunting her, too, the girl who'd seen too much. Whisper Springs lay 3 days' walk from Silver Bend, a secret tucked in the folds of the desert, where only the brave or the desperate dared tread. Isabel clutched her glass shard, its edge catching the dawn's first light, and followed Koa into a world where the rules were written in sand and blood. The Arizona sun climbed slow, a merciless eye glaring down on the cracked earth. Koa led the way through canyons that twisted like the veins of some ancient beast, his steps silent despite the gravel underfoot. Isabel trailed close, her bare feet tough as leather, but stinging with every misstep. Her dress hung in rags, and the shard of glass, her only weapon, was tied to her wrist with a strip of cloth. She didn't talk much, but her eyes drank in everything. The way Koa scanned the horizon, the way he paused to listen when a hawk's cry cut the silence. They moved at night to dodge McDurrow's riders, whose dust clouds hung like ghosts on the trail behind. By day, they hid in the shade of boulders or shallow caves, sipping water Kopa coaxed from barrel cacti with a knife he'd scavenged from the tent's wreckage. "Pinch the flesh here," he showed her, slicing a spiny chunk and squeezing clear liquid into a tin cup. Isabel drank, wincing at the bitter tang, but it kept her alive. Koa was no stranger to this land. His hands knew its secrets, where to find roots that dulled hunger, how to read the stars like a map. But his silence carried a weight heavier than the heat. Isabel caught him staring at the distance, his jaw tight, as if the desert held answers he wasn't ready to face. "Who's Nalin?" she asked one dusk, as they crouched by a smokeless fire of dry mesquite. "My brother," Koa said, his voice low, like it hurt to let the words out. "Younger. Always laughing." McDurrow took him at Whisper Springs. Took everyone. Isabel nodded, her throat tight. She thought of Maria, locked in some cell, her coughs unanswered. "We'll get 'em back," she said, more to herself than to him. Koa didn't reply, but his eyes softened, just for a moment. He taught her more than survival. On the second night, under a sky sharp with stars, he carved a small bow from a mesquite branch, stringing it with sinew from his belt. "You're quick," he said, handing it to her. "Learn this." Isabel's hands shook as she nocked a crude arrow, her first shot sailing wide into the dark. Koa didn't laugh. "Again," he said, and by dawn, she could hit a cactus from 10 paces. The bow felt alive in her grip, like it carried a piece of the desert's own fire. Folks, if this story's got you hooked on Isabel's grit and Koa's fight, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's your support that keeps these tales of the frontier alive, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Their path grew harder. The canyons narrowed, walls closing in like jaws. Koa taught her Apache words to lighten the miles. Tse for stone, Weakomi for dog, Weakomi Wiu for McDurrow, bad dog. Isabel grinned despite herself, repeating it under her breath. But the lessons stopped when they found tracks. Fresh hoofprints, too many for a lone rider. McDurrow's men were closing in. On the third dawn, the air turned sweet, carrying the scent of water. Whisper Springs was close. Koa slowed, his hand on the knife at his hip. "Stay low," he whispered. They crept over a ridge, and there it was, a hidden valley where clear pools gleamed like silver under cottonwood trees. But the beauty was marred by ruin, burned jacals, scattered bones, a child's sandal half buried in the mud. A shadow moved. Koa drew his knife, but an old woman's voice stopped him cold. "Put that away, boy. You're late." Taya, an Apache elder, stepped from the trees, her face lined like the canyons themselves. Beside her stood Soko, a mute boy of 7, his eyes wide but empty. They were the last of Whisper Springs, survivors of McDurrow's slaughter. Taya studied Isabel, her gaze sharp as flint. "This one's no ordinary child," she said. "She carries our fire in her hands." Isabel shifted, uneasy under the weight of those words. But Koa nodded, his expression unreadable. They took shelter in a cave above the springs, its mouth hidden by brush. Taya shared a meager meal of dried venison and told them of the massacre, how McDurrow's men came for the water, the land, the future. "They think they've won," she said, her voice steady. "But the desert doesn't forget." As night fell, the sound of distant hooves echoed through the valley. Koa's hand tightened on his knife. Isabel gripped her bow, the mesquite wood warm against her palm. Whisper Springs was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, and McDurrow's wolves were howling at the gate. The hoofbeats grew louder, a drumroll of doom rolling through Whisper Springs Valley. Isabel's fingers tightened around her mesquite bow, its sinew string humming with the promise of fire. McDurrow's wolves had found their prey, and the desert night was about to burn. Under a sky black as gunpowder, the canyon walls of Whisper Springs loomed like silent judges. McDurrow's camp sprawled below a jagged ridge, a cluster of canvas tents and a wagon loaded with powder kegs, its lanterns casting greasy light on 15 men sharpening blades and checking revolvers. The marshal himself stood by the fire, his silhouette broad as a barn door, barking orders with the confidence of a man who'd never lost. He thought the springs were his for the taking, the last Apache holdout to be crushed under his boot. He hadn't counted on a 10-year-old girl with a bow and a grudge. Inside the cave, Taya's eyes gleamed like obsidian as she handed Isabel a small clay pot of pine resin mixed with lamp oil. "This'll burn hotter than the devil's breath," she said, her voice steady. "Aim true, child." Koa hesitated, his knife half drawn, his gaze flicking between Isabel and the camp below. "She's too young for this," he muttered, but Taya cut him off. "Young don't mean weak. She's got the fire, let her use it." Isabel's heart pounded like a war drum, but her hands were steady as she wrapped the resin-soaked cloth around 4 arrowheads, tying them tight with strips of sinew. She'd only shot at cacti before, but the weight of the bow felt right, like an extension of her will. Soko, the mute boy, watched her with wide eyes, clutching a stick as if he could fight too. Koa placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low. "I do," Isabel replied, meeting his gaze. "For Mama. For Nalin. For all of them." Koa nodded, a flicker of pride breaking through his stoic mask. "We'll be ready when the fire falls." The plan was simple but brutal. Isabel would climb the ridge above the camp, loose her flaming arrows to sow chaos, and draw the men away from the wagon. Koa and the 2 Apache warriors Taya had summoned, silent as shadows, would slip in, take the powder kegs, and turn McDurrow's own weapons against him. If it worked, they'd have a chance. If it didn't, the canyon would be their grave. Isabel moved like a ghost, her bare feet finding purchase on the rocky slope. The night air bit her skin, but she barely felt it, her focus razor sharp. At the ridge's crest, she crouched behind a boulder, the camp spread out below like a target. She lit a small tinder bundle, its flame licking the resin on her first arrow. The bowstring creaked as she pulled, her arms trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. The first arrow flew, a streak of fire cutting the dark like a comet. It struck the powder wagon's tarp, flames blooming with a roar that shook the canyon. Shouts erupted, men scrambling as the fire spread. Isabel didn't wait. She lit the second arrow and sent it into McDurrow's tent, the canvas igniting like dry grass. The third hit a stack of hay, sending horses rearing in panic. The fourth, aimed at a barrel of whiskey, exploded in a fireball that lit the night red. McDurrow's voice boomed over the chaos. "Find the bastard! Shoot anything that moves!" His men fanned out, firing blindly into the dark, their bullets pinging off rocks. Isabel ducked low, her breath ragged, but a fierce grin split her face. She'd done it. The camp was a hornet's nest, and she'd kicked it hard. Below, Koa and the warriors moved like wolves, darting through the smoke. They reached the burning wagon, grabbing kegs before the flames could claim them. But McDurrow wasn't fooled for long. "It's the Apache," he roared, his revolver flashing as he fired into the shadows. One warrior grunted, clutching his arm, but Koa pulled him back, shoving a keg into his hands. "Move!" The camp was a maelstrom of fire and gunshots, horses breaking free, men coughing in the thickening smoke. Isabel watched from the ridge, her bow empty, her job done. but McDurrow's eyes scanned the heights, and for a moment, they locked onto hers. A predator sensing his true prey. "The girl!" he bellowed, pointing. "Get that little rat!" Isabel scrambled back, rocks skittering under her feet. Koa's voice cut through the din. "Run, Isabel! Now!" She bolted down the far side of the ridge, her heart a wild thing in her chest, the glow of the burning camp lighting her path. Behind her, the canyon echoed with McDurrow's rage, but the fire she'd set had bought them time. The wolves were scattered, and the night belonged to her. Isabel's feet flew over the canyon's jagged floor, her breath a ragged song, as she vanished into the desert's embrace. Behind her, McDurrow's camp burned, its flames licking the sky, a beacon that screamed defiance. The night had been hers, but dawn would demand a reckoning. The first light of morning broke over Whisper Springs, painting the valley in hues of blood and gold. Smoke curled from the ruins of McDurrow's camp, a blackened scar on the canyon's edge, where tents and wagons lay in heaps of ash. Koa emerged from the brush, his face streaked with soot, the stolen powder kegs hidden in a crevice where McDurrow's men wouldn't find them. The wounded Apache warrior leaned on him, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage, but alive. Taya and Soko waited at the cave's mouth, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. Isabel stumbled in last, her bow still clutched tight, her eyes wild with the fire she'd unleashed. "You did it, child," Taya said, her voice a low growl of pride. Isabel only nodded, too breathless to speak, her small frame trembling from the weight of what she'd done. She'd turned a hunter's camp into a pyre, but McDurrow was still out there, his rage a storm waiting to break. Koa scanned the horizon. "He'll come for us," he said, his knife glinting as he checked its edge. "But he's wounded now. Scattered." "Then we take the fight to Silver Bend," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion carving lines into her face. "We get Mama. We end this." The trek back was a gauntlet of heat and fear. They moved fast, skirting the open desert, using the canyon's shadows to hide their tracks. Taya carried Soko when the boy's legs gave out, her strength belying her age. By noon, the dust of Silver Bend's main street came into view, a haze that promised either salvation or a noose. Word of the fire had spread, carried by a spooked rider who'd fled the burning camp. The town buzzed like a kicked hive, voices rising from the saloon, the general store, the church. Isabel led them to the livery stable's back lot, where the air stank of manure and old hay. From there, they could see the jail, a squat adobe building with iron bars where Maria was held. Two of McDurrow's men lounged outside, rifles across their laps, but their eyes were nervous, darting to every shadow. The town was turning, its people whispering about the Apache girl who'd set the night ablaze. Koa crouched beside Isabel, his voice a whisper. "We need a distraction. Draw them out." She grinned, a spark of her old defiance flaring. "I'm good at distractions." Before he could stop her, she slipped away, darting to a stack of crates near the saloon. She grabbed a bottle from the trash, whiskey, half empty, and stuffed a rag into its neck. With a flint from her pocket, she struck a spark, and the rag caught fire. She hurled the bottle at a water trough across the street, the glass shattering in a burst of flame. The guards jumped, shouting, and ran toward the fire, leaving the jail unguarded. Koa and the warrior moved like specters, slipping inside. Moments later, they emerged with Maria, her face gaunt, but her eyes fierce as she saw Isabel. "Mi hija," she rasped, pulling her daughter into a crushing embrace. But Silver Bend wasn't done with them. McDurrow rode in at dusk, his face a mask of fury, 6 men at his back. The townsfolk gathered, their silence heavy, torn between fear and the truth Isabel had ignited. She stepped into the street, her bow slung across her back, her glass shard tied to her wrist. Koa stood beside her, his knife ready. "You think a kid and a savage can take me?" McDurrow spat, his revolver gleaming. Isabel's voice cut through the dust. "I saw you kill Nalin. I saw you burn your own men's hope for a paycheck. And now they see it too." She gestured to the crowd, where murmurs grew into shouts. A shopkeeper stepped forward, then a rancher, then a preacher, their faces hard with years of buried anger. McDurrow's men faltered, their guns lowering. The marshal's grin faded as the crowd closed in, a tide he couldn't outrun. "You're done," Koa said, his voice cold as the desert night. McDurrow lunged, but the townsfolk were faster, binding him with ropes meant for cattle. Whisper Springs was returned to the Apache, its waters free for the poor who'd been crushed by greed. Maria recovered in a new home, her cough easing with Tea's herbs. Isabel gave Koa a river stone, smooth as her courage. "For the fire we started," she said. He smiled, a rare warmth, and rode north with Tea and Soko, his silhouette fading into the dawn. Silver Bend never forgot the girl who turned ashes into justice, her name whispered in the wind that swept the now silent furnace clean. The desert dust settles, but Isabel and Koa's fire still burns bright in our hearts. What moved you most? The girl who turned ashes into justice, or the warrior who found hope in her courage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these stories alive. I'm grateful for every one of you joining this ride through the untamed frontier. If this tale sparked something in you, share it with someone who needs a little grit and fire in their day. Until our next journey under the Arizona stars, keep your bow strung and your heart fierce. See you on the trail, friends.